our search for real discoveries. Many people were shocked and fascinated when they saw our last documentary, Our Search for Sodom and Gomorrah. The sight of the ghostly walls and buildings of the ancient cities, standing in the desert beside the Dead Sea, struck a deep chord with so many people. With the aid of Simon's explanations of the biblical accounts, the cities lived once more. It was obvious things could not stop there, and he once again invites you to accompany him and his friends back to the Holy Land to try to animate the Bible's stories. The more Simon studied, the more he learned about this fascinating area. He read the archaeologists had discovered what they believed to be the very cave where Lot and his daughters sheltered, and that the tombs of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob do indeed exist to this day. He also found that on the last trip to the Dead Sea area, he and his team had often passed a place named Engedi, with no idea as to its historical importance. In fact, King David had hidden from King Saul in this secluded and fertile place. Sodom and Gomorrah are revisited during the search for Admah and the small town of Zoar, to which Lot fled with his daughters. They discover what appear to be tar pits, again mentioned in the Bible. Also on this amazing itinerary are visits to the great fortress of Mount Masada, Mamre, where Abraham saw God and his angels, Abraham's well, and Qumran, discovery site of the oldest recorded Bible. Simon's crew this time consisted of Einar, veteran cameraman of previous trips, and one new face, Peter Newsome, a friend. The team finally boarded their long-awaited flight to Israel, and the excitement was tangible. Were they really going to see these places for themselves, and how would they feel? Would it change their understanding of the Bible? Would they return different people? The Bible often says, "Seek and you will find," and they were about to do just that. After breakfast the following morning, the group hired a taxi to take them to a place called Hebron, Abraham's home according to the Bible. Hebron contains the most ancient site in Jewish history, second only in importance to the Temple on the Mount in Jerusalem. It is a tomb named Machpelah, Tomb of the Patriarchs. The Bible says that Abraham purchased a cave to bury his wife Sarah and an adjoining field. Abraham was considered a friend of God in Arabic, Al-Khalil, literally, the friend of God. The word Hebron is derived from the Hebrew word haver, meaning friend. Abraham resided here when he arrived in Canaan, and King David was anointed here, where he reigned for 7 years. Isaac was born in Hebron, as was Jonah, and Arab legend has it that the stone foundations were laid by King Solomon himself. Abraham insisted on paying the going rate for the site. He, his wife Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, and wives Rebekah and Leah are buried here. Only Jacob's wife is missing. She died bearing Joseph in Bethlehem. The Bible says Sarah lived for 127 years and died in Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. Genesis 23. Now Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep over her. Then Abraham rose from beside his dead wife and spoke to the Hittites. He said, "I am an alien and a stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site here so that I can bury my dead." The Hittites replied to Abraham, "You are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will refuse you." Abraham said, "Sell me the cave of Machpelah, which belongs to him and is at the end of his field. Ask him to sell it to me for the full price of a burial site among you." The Bible says that Abraham was offered the site free of charge, but he insisted on paying the full price of 400 shekels in silver. When the time came, he buried his wife Sarah in the cave. Simon found it amazing that shekels were still the currency of Israel today. Throughout the Byzantine, Arab, Mameluke, and Ottoman empires, This whole area has been the scene of war and unrest. Given this history, the wisdom of going there was discussed by the group. Einar and Simon were by now on their 4th visit to the area and fairly confident. It was decided they would go. A building built by Herod 2,000 years ago now covers the cave. The walls are 50 to 60 feet high and said to resemble the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The shrine is at present used as a mosque, and the building consists of 3 rooms containing richly decorated cenotaphs. These are covered in green tapestries, worked with inscriptions and verses. It is believed that they stand exactly above the tombs. Many violent incidents have occurred in this place. In May 1980, 6 Jewish students were killed and 20 wounded by Palestinians. In February 1994, 29 Muslim worshippers were killed and a further 129 wounded when a Jewish gunman opened fire in the building. The bullet marks can be seen today. Suffice to say, the general mood of the group was one of caution. Here then lie Abraham, Isaac, Sarah, and Jacob. Then Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man full of years, and he was gathered to his people. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre, in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite, the field Abraham had bought from the Hittite. There Abraham was buried with his wife Sarah. There are other significant sites of religious and historical interest at Hebron, including the tombs of Othniel. Buried here are Ben-Kamaz, first judge of Israel, Avner Benner, general and confidant to King Saul and David. Also there are Ruth and Jesse, great-grandmother and father to King David respectively. After they were given a guided tour by an earnest and charming guide, whose English accent they were sadly unable to decipher, the group went in search of Abraham's Oak. This turned out to be a short drive away and was signed Plain of Mamre, Abraham's Oak. This is believed to be the area where the Lord and 2 angels visited Abraham's camp and informed him that he would have a son named Isaac. Abraham built an altar here. Genesis 13 verse 18 tells us, "So Abraham moved his tents and went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he built an altar to the Lord." When the team arrived at the site, however, they found the gates locked and were reduced to peering through an iron gate. Was there still an altar there? The group moved to yet another site, that of Abraham's well. Still in the area of the great oaks of Mamre, where Abraham had his tents and flocks, the well still remains. Herod the Great built a wall around the entire area with the well in the corner, and in 325 AD, Christians built a church on the site. The group is standing in the ruins of the church, with Herod's 2-meter thick wall and Abraham's well still in evidence. It may have been used as a place of worship and was reconsecrated by Constantine. All present felt somewhat moved, being so close to a civilization from 3,900 years ago. The name Mamre is taken from a Canaanite chieftain who, together with Abraham, pursued Kedorlaomer to save Lot. The story is told in Genesis 14, verse 13. The group felt most disappointed at not seeing Abraham's oak and decided to try again. This time, the tour guide managed to locate the key holder for the gates, and the group walked down a long path which ended in a walled area. A very ancient and gnarled oak tree stands behind railings, supported by various means. According to tradition, it is opposite the very spot where Abraham dwelt in his tent when the angels promised him a son and heir. Here also he negotiated with Ephron the Hittite for Sarah's burial cave. Josephus is probably referring to it in Jewish Antiquities 110 number 4, where he writes, "Now Abraham dwelt near the oak called Ajiges." The place is in Canaan and is not far from Hebron. The exact age of the tree is not known, but it is certainly the oldest that anyone in the group had seen. Due to its great age, it has to be supported by both metal frames and wooden props. Genesis 18. The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre, while he was sitting at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. While they ate, he stood near them under a tree. The Lord said to Abraham, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Is it possible that this is the very tree? It is certainly very, very old. They left the area and drove through Hebron itself, bearing in mind that it would look somewhat different after nearly 4,000 years. In Simon's last documentary, he did not visit the other 3 cities of the plain, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar, the place to which Lot and his family fled. The question is, does anything remain of these places? And if so, where are they? Approaching the Dead Sea from the opposite shore to Sodom and Gomorrah, the group noticed what appeared to be unnatural shapes and shadows in the bright sunlight. It was suggested to Einar that they take a closer look, and they left the vehicle. Having a 4-wheel drive this time had enabled them to cover much more ground. Travel on foot in this area is completely exhausting. A particularly strange shape had caught Simon's eye, and he and Peter climbed toward it. The top was completely flat. It had flaked away in layers, rather like plaster. Simon thought it could well be the roof of a building or some kind of sphinx, but there was not enough left to be sure. Unlike Gomorrah, which is sheltered by surrounding mountains, these towns would be on the open plain and completely at the mercy of nearly 4,000 years of weather. Unable to do more, they moved on. They decided to return to Gomorrah. It was different this time anyway, because the 4x4 would enable them to drive right through the ancient city, and they could watch Peter's face as he saw it for the first time. Einar really enjoyed driving this off-roader. Being an Icelander, it certainly wasn't the first time he'd been in rough terrain. Eventually, they disembarked, and Simon held the camera as Einar and Peter disappeared into a cul-de-sac. Simon had just purchased a new high-definition camera, and he couldn't stop filming. At every visit, he saw something new. Einar and Peter suddenly went out of sight. Simon found a new source of brimstone balls, and he filmed with one hand whilst digging them up with the other. They were everywhere.
In our previous film, we took these mysterious balls of brimstone to the laboratories to be tested, and we were all amazed with the results.
An X-ray fluorescent technician was to supervise an analysis of the brimstone samples. In order to provide a sample good enough for the precision of the X-ray fluorescent spectrometer to read, Andy had to be very thorough in his preparation. In short, Simon's brimstone samples were to be analyzed. Then the same tests would be conducted on sulfur flowers that had been chemically refined by laboratory methods. He panned across the strange, ghostly city and noticed the silence again. Not even birds were singing. Einar and Peter eventually returned, excited by the hundreds of brimstone, death balls, which they had collected. They are the ultimate proof that God destroyed these evil cities, just as the Bible describes in Genesis 19, verse 24. Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah.
But if you're finding it actually sort of embedded in the walls and things like that,
to cut them out with the walls.
right? No, okay.
Yeah, my husband spent an hour cutting out
Right.
one out of actual rock where it was just so embedded in the rock because you couldn't actually pull it out.
Right.
I've got a prize specimen at home. It's about the size of my fist.
Right.
And I cut it right out the rock, and I stood in the rock, left it in there, it's come down,
Right.
and embedded itself.
Right.
Amazing.
No, I haven't seen anything like that.
They decided to drive further into the dead city, past the strange shapes and walls. All at once, the truck came to the end of the road they were on, and Einar suggested they should take a closer look at a building they had visited in the first film. Whilst climbing over it, they noticed that one of the ceilings had caved in. All suddenly realized that it was not a good idea to climb over hollow, crumbling structures. So much for the excitement of the moment. Nearby was a strange-looking building with a pointed roof, surrounded by tons of hard ash. They estimated the height at 50 feet or more, and Peter wanted to climb it. Simon watched his progress and fell to wondering what it had originally looked like. The white ashen remains stood out clearly against the backdrop of brown mountains and hills. Everyone who has been here has been affected by this strange, silent city, and the mind imagines the people and the things they did to so offend God. Genesis 13, verse 13. Now the men of Sodom were wicked and sinning greatly against the Lord. The Jewish Talmud, which contains much ancient history, has many stories concerning the evil in Sodom. One of Lot's daughters was condemned to death by burning for feeding a starving man, though she later escaped to Zoar. Another girl was covered in honey and stung to death by bees for helping a stranger. There are many more tales like that. The merry band decided to revisit Sodom.
Here is some footage of when we first visited Sodom.
Like Gomorrah, the cream ashen structures against the brown-colored mountains was even more marked at this level, but the architecture and layout of the city was very different. The buildings seemed to be arranged in terraces. Stream beds and watercourses, pebbles, water in abundance running right through the city, dams directing water sometimes under buildings, structures lining the banks of the streams, fossils, some that looked like mussels, fused together by what appears to be a great burst of heat. Simon and Imar had been here several times now and wanted to see the ruins in more detail. During the steep and slippery climb, he fell to thinking of the people who had lived here. Which of these piles would have housed Lot and his family? Which of these streets was trod by the angels? They returned to a large fortress-like construction. Similar in style to the buildings of Gomorrah at the bottom, it was topped with a stone wall with mortar joints, windows, and doors. Einar and Peter decided to risk climbing to the top. Einar and Peter continued to climb steadily, while Simon filmed from the safety of the ground and was most relieved when Einar reached the top. The ground underfoot was dry and crumbly, with no way of knowing which sections were hollow. The nearest help was many miles away. But fortune favored the brave, and they returned safely to Earth. The party were drawn once more to the dams and weirs of the old city, with an intact well constructed of the same materials as the fortress walls. It amazed everyone that they were able to look at and touch this very large piece of history after nearly 4 millennia. Genesis 13, verse 10. Lot looked up and saw that the whole plain of Jordan was well watered. They met a man living in a tent, pumping water in the area, and decided to ask him what he thought the building had been He replied that a king had lived here.
This is the king.
Was he speaking of the king of Sodom? Einar had decided to scale another of the buildings they had filmed on the last trip, and Simon jokingly reminded him that he was not insured. Einar, meanwhile, was being entertained with coffee by the gentleman in the tent. They noticed a large entrance to a nearby building and discussed the wisdom of entering it. Peter was keen to do so and entered first, while Simon followed more slowly with the camera. Suddenly, Simon was nearly trampled to death as Peter flew past him, shouting that the place was full of bats. They decided that it had to be explored, however, and Simon led the way with the camera, with Peter following and providing much-needed moral support. Having no light source, they both strained their eyes to determine the full extent of the cave or room. Switching the camera to night mode merely resulted in very jumpy pictures, and a cigarette lighter had little more effect. The shadows stretched away into the distance, but nothing more could be done without illumination, and they withdrew. Early next day, everyone was keen, rested, and in search of a new experience. Many times they had passed a sign to Engedi, and they had since learned that it was a very important historical site. This area then became the next goal for the expedition. Whilst driving past the Dead Sea en route for Engedi, many signs warning of open pits were noticed. This rang a bell with Simon, who remembered reading something about pits in this area. He asked Einar to stop, recalling Genesis 14. The king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, marched out and drew up their battle lines in the valley of Siddim. Could this be the valley of Siddim? It could very well be. The Bible says it happened by the Dead Sea, that is the Salt Sea, between the cities of the plain, and that's where they were standing at that moment. Finding another warning sign, they decided to discover what manner of pits the Bible referred to. Curiosity came to the fore. How big are they? How deep? How dangerous? They began to walk gingerly onward, keeping well clear of any soft-looking patches of ground. No one wanted to suddenly disappear. They came to a small ditch with a thin layer of shell over it. Things were getting interesting. This could obviously be a trap for the unwary. Nearby were larger pits, 2 to 3 feet deep, and Simon climbed a little way into one, noticing that the bottom appeared very dark in color. As they walked further on, another biblical verse sprang to mind. Genesis 14, verse 10. And the vale of Siddim was full of slime pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, and fell there, and they that remained fled to the mountains. The group were surrounded by these pits, some huge and deep, and once again, the accuracy of the Bible amazed them. The bottom of these deeper pits could most definitely be described as slime. Looking behind them, the mountain stood, dark and brooding, and they that remained fled to the mountains. Obviously, the pits had been uncovered over thousands of years by the gradual evaporation of the Dead Sea, because traces of crystalline salt and other minerals could clearly be seen shining on the crusted edges. Not until after his return to the UK did Simon realize that they had forgotten to dig some samples for analysis. The Israeli authorities are in the process of filling these pits with hardcore for health and safety reasons, and so time is short. To establish exactly where the pits were that were mentioned in the Bible, it would be necessary to know the exact level of the sea 3,900 years ago, and this was beyond their capability. Peter and Einar noticed that the ground was still soft and hollow right up to the road where the ancient pits could have been. Just as they were preparing to drive on, Simon filmed thousands of tons of hardcore piled up and ready to fill the dangerous pits. It brought a lump to his throat as he realized that history was about to become a new tourist beach. Having done a bit more research on Engedi, the group had realized that it was far more important than they had first thought. It receives more than one mention in the Bible and raised a few questions. For example, how could people live in this inhospitable place without shelter, food, and water? It was the lowest place on earth, and the daytime temperatures were unbearable in the summer. As they walked through the gates of what is now a national park, their questions were swiftly answered. They came to the end of a winding path. There, sitting on the western shore of the Dead Sea, was a large and beautiful oasis. 4 streams run through this place year-round and fed from the mountains. Millions of gallons of clear, fresh water are available for agriculture and bottling. Engedi is a sanctuary for many types of plants, birds, and animals, including plants from the tropical desert like the Sodom apple, acacia, jujube, and poplar. Balsam was the specialty of Engedi, and the fruit was used to produce a valuable perfume used in trade. This boundless supply of fresh, clear water has created both desert and tropical environments, and there is a diverse selection of animals to be found here. Foxes, wolves, hyenas, and the famous leopards all reside in this paradise in the wilderness. Many birds are to be seen, and magnificent vultures and eagles breed and soar above the cliffs. Reptiles exist, including the black viper, Israel's deadliest serpent. Both tropical and Mediterranean fauna can be seen, and due to the abundant water supply, the place has been a magnet for humans since time immemorial. The party examined one of the streams, and Peter was tempted to play King David. The Bible describes many events which occurred in this area around 1000 BC. Samuel 23, verse 29. And David went up from thee and lived in the strongholds of Engedi. David hid from King Saul in this place. Samuel 1:19 says that King Saul wanted to kill David, and he chose to flee to Engedi and hide in comfort. Who could blame him? The name Engedi means the spring of the kid goat, and there is ample evidence that young ibex have always lived near these springs. David's pursuers evidently roamed the crags of the ibex in search of him. In one of these caves, David cut off the corner of Saul's robe. Samuel 1 verse 24 tells us King Saul was told that David was in the desert of Engedi. He chose 3,000 men from all Israel and set out to search for David and his men. By the crags of the wild goats, near some sheep pens, he found a cave and went in to relieve himself. The fugitives were far back in the cave, but David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. There are many caves here, and this may have happened in one of them. Hiking further, they came to a beautiful waterfall where people still shelter and swim in the clear waters. The party could imagine David bathing here, resting from the interminable heat, perfectly hidden and supplied with food and drink. According to the Bible, King David's son Solomon wrote the Song of Songs in this wonderland. Song of Songs, verse 14. My lover to me, a cluster of henna blossoms from the vineyards of Engedi. In this verse, Solomon compared his lover to the blossoms of Engedi, a clear indication of the beauty and fertility of the site. Genesis 14, verse 7, describes the war of 4 kings against 5 kings, and mentions the Amorites who dwelt in Hazazon Tamar. This is identified as Engedi in Chronicles. Simon struggled to keep up with Einar and Peter as they continued to climb the steep mountain, and his natural fear of heights didn't help much. They were eventually rewarded for their effort by finding a Chalcolithic or Copper period temple dating back approximately 5,000 years. In the center stood a large washing basin. In a separate room were the remains of an altar. Archaeologists discovered animal bones and ash in this altar, clear indications that sacrifices took place here. The simplest form of altar consists of a pile of stones surmounted by a flat surface of available material, usually stone or wood. Some include blood drains or channels, and altars intended for burnt offerings would sometimes have a depression or hollow for the fire. Some had canopies, and the early examples are usually outdoors. Here, animals were sacrificed to a god. It is unclear at this point whether this site was Christian. Since Jesus was crucified and died for us, a riddle remained until archaeologists discovered ritual instruments in a cave in the Mishmar riverbed, south of Engedi. 429 vessels of copper and ivory that apparently belonged to the temple were found, and they are now in the Israeli Museum in Jerusalem. Standing on the upper plateau of the mountain with the amazing views toward Jordan, everyone was happy to be here. The group next decided to have a look at a place called Qumran on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. This site boasted a Jewish population as far back as 800 BC, and for 200 years it was home to a breakaway group called the Essenes. They lived and studied here and were Qumran's true claim to fame. The crew walked through what had been a large building indeed, comprising of assembly halls and a central dining room, a kitchen and baths, a laundry room and watchtower, a stable and pottery workshop, and most importantly, a scriptorium. Here, among the desks and inkwells over 2,000 years ago, the Essene scribes wrote the famous Dead Sea Scrolls. These Jewish historical documents were discovered here in 11 caves in 1947 and 1956. Probably the most important discovery of our time, the scrolls have had great impact on biblical scholarship. Most curious among them is the Copper Scroll, which lists 64 hiding places in Israel of treasures such as silver and gold, aromatics and manuscripts, believed to be from Solomon's temple, and possibly hidden prior to the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in 587 BC. There are also stories of such figures as Enoch, Noah, and Abraham. Josephus wrote, "And after this purification is over, they everyone meet together in an apartment of their own, into which it is not permitted to any of another sect to enter, while they go after a pure manner, into the dining room as into a certain holy temple." the party learned that these 2,000-year-old scripts are identical to our Bible today. Mount Masada, on the eastern fringes of the Judean desert, was another place not to be missed on the journey. Situated between Engedi and Sodom, it is detached from the surrounding escarpment, approximately 650 by 450 meters and 450 meters above Dead Sea level. Being remote and with natural defenses, an impressive fortress was built on the plateau during the Second Temple period. The story of Masada is recorded by Flavius Josephus, who commanded the Galilee district during the Great Revolt and eventually surrendered to the Romans. He was taken to Rome, where he chronicled the revolt for posterity. Josephus wrote that the first fortress at Masada was built by Jonathan, probable brother of Judah the Maccabee, high priest in 152 BC. Herod ruled from 37 to 4 BC and was aware of the strategic importance of Masada. Unsurprisingly, he chose to take refuge here from his enemies and used it as a winter palace. During his reign, palaces, storerooms, cisterns, and a large casement wall were built, and after his death in 4 BC, the Romans stationed a garrison there. According to Josephus the Great, revolt of the Jews against the Romans began in 66 AD, and a varied group, including Essenes and Samaritans, fled to the fortress. These were joined by the last of the rebels in 70 AD, after the fall and destruction of Jerusalem, when the fortress was under the command of Eleazar ben Yair. It was the largest rebel stronghold in Judah, and Flavius Silva laid siege to it with 8,000 men. Auxiliary troops camped at the base of the mountain, and a great ramp was built on a natural slope to the west using wooden supports. This can still be seen here. After a few months, the besiegers brought up a siege tower to begin battering the walls. Josephus describes how Eleazar ben Yair made 2 speeches, convincing the 960 defenders that it would be better to kill themselves and their families than to face shame and humiliation as Roman slaves. He tells of 10 people chosen to act as executioners. People embraced them, offering their throats to the knife, and when this was done, the executioners turned on one another, the last killing himself. They died in the firm belief that no one survived. 2 women and 5 children, however, had been hiding among the cisterns on the mountaintop and described to the Roman soldiers what had occurred that dreadful night. It was the first day of Passover. The fall of Masada was the final act of the Roman conquest of Judah. The fortress at Masada is not mentioned in the Bible, yet it is a popular tourist destination and thousands visit it every year. Few, if any, know that to get there, they must drive through the ruined city of Gomorrah. The views from the mountain are breathtaking, and you can clearly see the ashes. What better way for God to remind us what happened to the ungodly, and what will happen to us if we do not repent from our sins? Peter chapter 2, verse 6. if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah by burning them into ashes and making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. The group wished to visit Zoar as they had Admah to see if anything remained of the town. They knew that Zoar was one of the 5 cities destroyed by brimstone, but not if anything remained of it. Genesis 19 tells us of how Lot and his family fled to this area to escape the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Simon knew of a place named Al-Safi, also called Zoar, and they elected to try this. They set off for the farthest point of the Dead Sea area, and to their disappointment were confronted by the Jordanian border. Imagine the frustration as they looked at their goal through a border fence, within filming distance, but unapproachable. Even worse, there was said to be a site called Lot's Monastery in the hills above the town. This was another place that Lot visited with his daughters during his flight to the caves. Genesis 19, verse 30. Lot and his 2 daughters left Zoar and settled in the mountains, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. He and his 2 daughters lived in a cave. Staring across the border, they began to realize that even more traveling was on hand. 5 minutes was about to become 6 hours. All were determined to see this piece of biblical history. They now had to travel back, past Sodom, Gomorrah, Engedi, and Qumran, to Jericho, Admah, and the border bridge with Jordan on the opposite side of the Dead Sea. They reached the border after a 3-hour drive, only to take another hour to cross it. The party became a little concerned when Simon was told to put the camera away by an armed border guard. Finally, they were across and they hired a taxi and took off on another 3-hour drive to just short of their starting point, but on the other side of the fence. Everyone was quite surprised by the differences between Israel and Jordan. The military were very much in evidence here, and they constantly passed through roadblocks guarded by armored vehicles. The houses were very different from the UK, being mostly box-like and single-story. They stopped for a refreshment at some local shops when Einar, being the daring one of the team, decided to start filming. Suddenly, they were surrounded by children who just stared at them in fascination. Just as they were resuming the journey, the driver suddenly pointed to a rock on the cliffs and informed them that this was Lot's wife. This they didn't believe, as it was too far from Sodom and on the wrong side of the Dead Sea. Excitement grew as they neared their destination, and on the right was the tip of the Dead Sea. They had completed the long circular journey begun 6 hours ago and were now back at its southern tip. Finding a sign indicating that Lot's monastery lay somewhere ahead, they gratefully left the taxi. The remains of a building could be seen halfway up a nearby mountainside, and this was reputed to be the most significant archaeological site in the whole of Jordan. A large meandering staircase was cut into the side of the mountain, and everyone eyed it with some misgivings. There was nothing for it but to climb. and after several rest stops, the mood lightened as they approached the ruins of an ancient monastery. Built around the entrance to a cave sometime in the 6th century AD. The cave is set at the far end of the north aisle, and the fine mosaic work is perfectly preserved. To the right is a huge reservoir, which made monastic life possible. The party eventually entered the cave and were amazed to be confronted by masonry and brickwork, which archaeologists have dated to the time of Abraham. Genesis 19, verse 36. So both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The elder daughter had a son, and she named him Mobe. He is the father of the Moabites today. The younger daughter also had a son, and she named him Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites of today. It is believed that although this was incest, the daughters truly believed that no one else had been left alive. The views from the monastery toward Al-Safi, now called Zoar, were truly astounding. Lot now becomes something of an enigma, as from this time forward, he is never again mentioned in the scriptures. This latest trip also ends at this place. The facts have now been presented, and you, the jury, are out.